10 years ago, the general public was relatively unaware of the drug fentanyl, a synthetic opioid created to kill pain during surgeries. That has all changed in recent years, however, with fentanyl topping the list as the #1 cause of overdose deaths in the country. If you pay attention to the news cycle, you've likely seen deaths linked to the drug in your community. And with more than 70,000 overdose deaths attributed to synthetic opioids like fentanyl in 2021, you might even know somebody who was lost. There's no two ways about it. It's a full-blown epidemic, which is why it's the main focus of this episode of the Stan State EduCast. We're lucky enough to have two guests willing to share their expertise on the issue as we try to inform listeners of the drug's origins and dangers while dispelling misconceptions and providing information on overdose prevention. If you have questions about fentanyl, this is the podcast for you. So, without further ado, let's welcome our guests, Dr. Suzanne Whitehead of the College of Education, Kinesiology, and Social Work, and Detective Leland Lawson of the Stanislaus County Sheriff's Department.
You're listening to the Stan State EduCast, produced on the campus of Stanislaus State.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, before we get into the issue of this dangerous drug, let's start with some personal intros. How are you part of the Warrior community? And we'll start with Detective Lawson.
I actually attended Stanislaus State from 2013 to 2015. I transferred in from Modesto Junior College as a junior, and I graduated in the summer of 15 with my bachelor's degree in criminal justice.
I've been here since 2016, and I am the coordinator of the Counselor Education Program. We have 3 different tracks. We have a Counselor in Education by itself track. We have Counselor in Education Plus, Pupil Personnel Services, which is school counseling, or we have Masters in Counseling Plus, the Professional Clinical Counselor, which is the mental health counselor. So I have been the coordinator. I'm an associate professor, and I've been the coordinator since 2018. I'm also a licensed addiction counselor. I have worked in the addiction field as the director of an outpatient clinic for 10 years previously, and I teach addiction courses here. So I always keep my credentials, licenses up to date.
So the most basic question I can come up with to start things off, what is fentanyl?
So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. Like you said, it was originally created in the 1960s to dull pain in surgeries. It's considered what we call a Schedule II narcotic. And what that means is there is some legitimate medical purposes to it. Fentanyl is still used in hospitals in surgeries. It's actually given to women during labor to help with the pain. But the epidemic of fentanyl doesn't come from the legal medical uses for it. It comes from the synthetic and false advertisement of fentanyl, which is laced into heroin and other drugs, causing an addiction problem. As it's an opioid, it causes major addiction in the human body, and people are unable to get rid of it. Due to its potency, it's extremely lethal. That's why fentanyl is by far more dangerous than pretty much any other drug on the market right now.
Right. The addiction problem really skyrocketed in the 1990s. And that's when Oxycontin, Oxycodone, Vicodin, Norcos, all of those were really introduced by big pharmaceuticals. And Purdue Pharmaceuticals is one of the worst with the Sackler brothers. But, it was touted as being the most amazing, unbelievable medication that you could give patients. And doctors, take the Hippocratic Oath. They want to do no harm. So they believed the hype that it wasn't addicting and it was going to be this miracle drug, and started, giving it to patients, and it worked really well. However, those of us in the substance use disorder field were screaming from the rooftops in the 90s and into the 2000s that nothing can be that good, without consequences, just like they thought cocaine and heroin were perfectly fine many decades ago. So really started about the late 1990s, 2000s, where they started seeing people having problems. Fast forward to 2016, because it took that long to get the outrage across to, and I'm not blaming physicians, they really want to help their patients, but they also got big incentives to write all these prescriptions. But by 2016, physicians were writing over 200 million prescriptions for opioids in the United States. And so they were, chastised for that. And many of them even went out of business because they wrote too many prescriptions and so on. And so they started, okay, that's it. I'm not going to write anymore. Well, we already had a nation of people who are addicted to all these medications. And so they had to turn to the streets. And heroin is available, cocaine's available, but nothing real, like the sheriff said, nothing is as potent. Morphine is 3 times stronger than codeine, and fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. So when they used to give people, for surgeries or whatever, some morphine or some codeine or whatever, that usually worked really well. But for people with chronic pain or severe burns, they've been in terrible accidents, whatever, nothing really will touch it except fentanyl. So what happened is from 2016 on, it has just skyrocketed. And because the pandemic really took over, the opioid epidemic was put on the back burner. So now it's found in absolutely every single drug except for marijuana, although it's probably in there too, but that's the latest, and alcohol. It's in every other drug that you can imagine. So
extremely potent. And as you mentioned, Detective Lawson, not a lot to cause an overdose, right? I'm reading here, 2 milligrams is a potential lethal dose. What does that look like physically? What does 2 milligrams look like?
So we're looking at essentially a couple grains of salt. It is extremely small. If we can imagine, say you're sitting at a diner and you break open a sugar packet, that's about 1 gram. If you break that into tenths, so 10 little strips, in the narcotics world, in the detective world, we'll consider 1/10 a usable amount of most drugs. You half that, and that's a usable amount for addicts, which is 0.05 of fentanyl. You half that, and the average user or a new user can overdose on even less than half of that, and it can cause them to die. Fentanyl, and one of the most interesting things about it is that there are many analogs of it. And an analog is essentially a small chemical change made to a drug to turn it into an entirely different drug that's undetectable when being imported into the country. There's thousands of analogs of fentanyl, and when you change the chemical composition of it, what you end up doing is creating maybe a weaker or a stronger version. And whereas the doctor said earlier, you can have up to 100 times the effect of morphine, the most powerful form of fentanyl that we know of is called carfentanil, which is 10,000 times stronger than morphine and is essentially used in a medical term for tranquilizing elephants.
Right. You can't even touch it.
You can't even touch it. That would be nearly considered a biological weapon because it's so lethal in those amounts. Something like that, a microscopic amount would kill a human being. And then there are analogs and dosages of different kinds of fentanyl that range from the weaker kinds to kinds that are resistant to Narcan, which can negate the effects of opiates, and then some that are weaker in general, some that are stronger. The problem is when you look at a white powder or any other kind of powder, you have no idea what kind it is. It takes a chemical lab to tell you exactly what kind of fentanyl that is, or if it's even fentanyl. That's what makes it so dangerous. You don't know what you're taking. Even if someone says, this is what this is, there's no way that person knows unless they're a certified lab technician.
So Oxycontin, Oxycodone, Vicodin, Norco was very, very difficult to get on the streets. And approximately it's $1 per milligram. So, I mean, that changes depending on where you are, of course, but somebody who has a high tolerance already built up in their systems, they might need 8, 10, 12 pills a day. So now you're talking around $300 a day for just those pills, which are hard to find. Heroin is like $10 a hit, they call it, and you might need 7 or 8 of those for the same effect. So now you're combining or comparing $300 for the pills and $80 for the same effect with heroin. And heroin is an opiate. It's a natural opiate that is derived from the opium poppy. And that's only 5 times stronger than morphine. So that's hard to wait for. You have to, develop the plants. You have to grow the plants. You have to process everything, whereas fentanyl, they can just make, very, very quickly within a few hours in a lab. They know now that they can just make that. And it's very, very easy to, to manufacture pills to make them look like even stamped to look like the real thing. And so what we're seeing in the Central Valley are a lot of young people who have experienced difficulties throughout the pandemic, like all of us have. And then they contact their cousins, roommates, best friends, and they think it's safe then because they got it through somebody that they sort of kind of know, or they just ordered off the internet. They don't know what they're taking. Somebody who doesn't have any tolerance, like you said, 2 milligrams, and they're gone. They might know instantaneously that something is terribly, terribly wrong, and they're gone.
What's the cause for the proliferation of fentanyl? Is it just the greed for the manufacturers and the dealers, or is it because it's so potent that the users get more of a high with less?
So my primary responsibility is I'm in a narcotics unit for the sheriff's department. One of the things I do is I speak with users and dealers regarding their addiction, regarding their use, to bolster my own knowledge, my own expertise on this, not necessarily always to obtain prosecution. What you find is most of the addicts that I deal with, and most of even the fentanyl dealers, began with heroin use. As the doctor said earlier, it was a natural opioid. You had then the epidemic of fentanyl, and it was introduced initially as a cut in heroin. And by a cut, I mean it was mixed with the heroin to make it stronger. So now you imagine you have two dealers, one selling regular heroin and the other selling heroin laced or cut with fentanyl. You buy from both of them, one is significantly stronger than the other, and now the high or the pleasure you would obtain from using original heroin no longer satisfies you. You now want that dealer that had the cut with fentanyl. And before you know it, now you're addicted to the fentanyl without even knowing it. And that's initially how this epidemic started. Those users then progressed to straight fentanyl, and then that was then introduced as becoming the prominent opioid drug in the area. And now you see heroin actually falling off in use, largely because fentanyl is a much better high, and it's around the same price point.
Right.
On the streets, we can purchase heroin for about $75 to $150 a gram, fentanyl for $75 to $150 per gram, based on the quality and the dealer that you're talking to. And I know this from doing this kind of work.
So what are the effects of fentanyl on the human body compared to heroin, compared to some of these other opiates or other drugs?
Give or take, heroin is about 5 times as strong as morphine, whereas fentanyl is 100 times as strong. So you see a lot of the same things, but more quickly often. But they get this euphoric feeling. It releases endorphins, endogenous morphine throughout your body. A drug cannot work at all unless it has the same chemical composition and receptor sites within the brain. So it hooks into those receptor sites, and instead of your body saying, okay, I've had enough, I'm really euphoric, I'm happy, it just keeps those floodgates open and open and open and open. So they experience this extreme euphoria. But it also can affect their respirations and decrease their respirations. It can lower their heart rate. It can lower their blood pressure. And they can stay in that euphoric state for several minutes, even a few hours before that starts to dissipate. With higher doses, though, or somebody that isn't at all used to taking any kind of fentanyl or heroin, or any of the other kind of opiates or opioids, it can basically shut down their respirations, and then their heart will stop, and that's it. And that's sadly, tragically, when you find people and they're already gone.
If I'm correct, Prince and Tom Petty died from fentanyl overdoses, right?
I believe so. I'd have to look back.
So it's hitting, it's not just hitting the streets, it's hitting all sorts of demographics and populations.
They usually have many of those. Again, we like to refer them more as poisonings because it takes the stigma off of the person if they've been poisoned rather than, an overdose. But a lot of times when it's famous people like that, they have such a cocktail of drugs and medications, and they usually have someone providing them for them. And, like Michael Jackson and so on, and they just give them too much at one time. And it's such a delicate balance that the human body and biochemistry is so unique to every single person. Like I said, what one person can tolerate, someone else would be flat out, passed out, whatever. So
it's a highly potent drug, so it's sought out by addicts. But a lot of the deaths I've seen in headlines are from recreational users, young people, like you mentioned. So how can people identify fentanyl in maybe a different drug? They're not looking for fentanyl. They're looking for cocaine or whatever they're into. How can they identify fentanyl within those drugs?
So with cocaine, it's quite simply a white powder, right? And the problem is fentanyl comes in many forms and sizes, but one of them is a white powder. It's almost impossible to distinguish with the naked eye fentanyl from cocaine, to the point to where we have devices in my unit that can essentially shoot a laser into something and it tells you what it is. But even then, until it gets to a lab, can we confirm or deny the presence of fentanyl in a drug? And what I'm getting at is by just looking at something, you can't. Fentanyl also comes in different colors. You'll see things like green, blue, yellow. It has a consistency of sidewalk chalk in its powder form. I've seen fentanyl pressed into bricks of rainbows, and there's literally layers of different colors. M30 pills, false Oxycontins, right? They're 6 millimeters in diameter, and they are imported from other countries into this country. They're sold on the streets and marketed as either blues or 30s. A boat goes for about $3,000. That's 1,000 pills, right? The problem with these is you don't know the potency of each pill, and most are laced with fentanyl, but how much is unknown because this is made on someone's tabletop of just mixing chemicals together. They have a pill press and they're pressed into these forms. That's then distributed to teenagers, young adults throughout the country who smoke these pills and having no idea what the mixture of the fentanyl to whatever else is in that pill. There's no way of knowing until it either goes to a lab or it goes into your body and the effects are seen immediately. In looking at just powders, you couldn't tell from the naked eye, right? The other problem is fentanyl doesn't only come in the form of M30s and these small blue pills. They come in the form of Xanax, Hulks, which are green, essentially green looking Xanax, Percocets, all sorts of different things that are sold on the black market as actual legitimate prescription pills that are not. They're imported usually from Mexico or from China, and they are laced with fentanyl and sold on the streets for a far less price than true Xanax is. Those pills are then taken by young adults thinking they're having fun at pill parties or taking something that's going to get them high or low, and it kills them almost immediately because it's laced with a drug they've never taken before. And just as the doctor had said earlier, their body shuts down. They stop breathing, and before somebody realizes and can administer Narcan or get them to a hospital, they've already died.
It's so quick. I know that Stanislaus Recovery Center distributes these test strips now that anybody can get. And I'm sure there's other agencies like that do that. But I know for a fact, because I know some people that work there, and I've seen the test strips. And, you know, people have all different kinds of opinions and ideas about harm reduction, you know, providing needles and so on, you know, for people who have problems with addiction. But it may actually save somebody's life. So I am a huge proponent of if we're not going to stop drug abuse, people like to self-medicate for many, many reasons, which we would take a lot more than this hour program or whatever to talk about. But we're not going to stop people from using because they medicate their physical and emotional, psychological issues. And if you have these test strips and they become more common and more widespread, people can at least test them. It's not 100%, but boy, it's a lot better than looking at a tablet or looking at a stack of powder and saying, I wonder what's in there. And at least you'll have some knowledge base to work off of to see if you still want to use that substance or not.
As you mentioned, people are going to take drugs. It's been happening for centuries, if not for all of humankind. I was going to ask if there's such thing as responsible drug use anymore with the rise of fentanyl.
That's a good question.
That's very difficult to answer. I mean, from the law enforcement perspective, right? Even if you take the prosecutorial side away, right, where we're not looking at making arrests, I think you're gambling your life, right? Every single time you use a drug, you only have a certain belief that it's something that you're taking. We don't know for certain that that's actually going on. We don't know exactly what we're ingesting into our bodies. We may believe it's one thing, but again, without actual testing, there's no way of knowing what it is or the potency. Even if you intend to take fentanyl, right? You don't know the potency of the fentanyl that you're taking. There's no way to tell what analog it is. And just because your dealer or your family member or someone who provided this to you, a friend, says it's one thing, they don't really know. They may actually truly believe that, but they're not working in a lab, right? They didn't have an actual technician say, hey, this is the composition of whatever this powder or pill is, and it's safe to take. So I think that what happens is we get comfortable as human beings, especially if we've used before. We're like, oh, I've used this before. I have a tolerance. I'm going to be okay.
Right.
And then once this effect set in and you're not okay, it's not impossible to bring somebody back, but now the clock is ticking very rapidly, whether or not you can save this person's life. And if someone is in a position to render you aid, and if they're not, you're most likely going to die.
Could be seconds or minutes. Yeah. I think the sheriff and I have just seen too many people that have overdosed and died from. I've gone to an awful lot of funerals in my lifetime as a substance use disorder, clinic director, and also in just loved ones that have dealt with this, family members, loved ones, and in teaching these courses. So the only safe way to use a medication like opioids is honestly to have it prescribed through a methadone maintenance clinic, and highly, highly regulated, more so than any other clinic, any other medical clinic known to mankind. And they have to have counseling. They have to come in every single day. They have measured doses. They watch them take it and so on. And those people actually can stay on methadone maintenance for years and years. Many of them do, and have very respectable positions in life. Some of them are doctors and nurses, and probably even officers, and professors, certainly. I mean, whatever. But because it's so regulated and they don't get high anymore, but it's a maintenance just like if you had diabetes, heart disease, emphysema, cancer, whatever. So those really are the only safe ways recreationally to have some sort of opioids.
So it might be hard to identify the drug itself, but what about the symptoms of an overdose? What are the signs that somebody is overdosing on fentanyl?
So the biggest sign that you're going to see is the street lingo would be going on the nod. And what it looks like is somebody begins to fall asleep. They'll take the drug, whether they're smoking it or ingesting it, and immediately their eyes start to flutter or start to roll back. Their head starts to nod down, almost as if you're exhausted, right? Your eyelids are closing, and they fall asleep in the position that they're in. And it's almost instantaneously,
Yes.
especially if it's smoked. So the fastest way to get any drug into your system is by inhaling it. It passes the blood-brain barrier, and it immediately causes an effect on the body. It's even faster than injecting something into your blood. That's why fentanyl is most commonly smoked. So when you see the inhalation of the smoke, people will start to go down. And when they stop breathing and their respiration rate slows to the point of they're no longer, the rise and fall of the chest is no longer going on, and they're not conscious anymore, you have a sign of an immediate overdose.
Right.
Most fentanyl users that do not overdose, they'll start to nod off, but they'll still be conscious. They'll still have eye movement. Their breathing will still be there. Major telltale sign is they stop breathing and they've gone completely unconscious on the first or the second hit. And it's affected them that quickly. And that's when you need to administer Narcan as fast as possible to save their life.
I have loved ones who thought they were using heroin and told me, of course they live, thank God, but told me that they had no idea. They had been using the same dealer, the same quote unquote dose, the same amount, injecting it for however long. And the second they injected and it was laced with fentanyl, they knew something, like I said, was terribly, terribly wrong. And then you're out. There's nothing you can do about it. And so I was mentioning, and the audience can't see, but CDC several years ago, maybe 2018, recommended that all healthcare providers, whether they're counselors or nurses or doctors or physicians, whatever, carry at least some sort of Narcan with them. And so I was able to go to CVS and tell them that I am a licensed mental health counselor, and I carry this small little tiny vial of Narcan with me and a little tiny, what they call diabetic syringe. And I just carry that with me. If you see somebody and you think possibly, maybe, what if that they are going through some sort of poisoning, then you can use this and inject them. There's only one dose in here, but it just may be enough to bring them back until medical supervisors and personnel can come. They often will need more than one dose, depending on how much Narcan fentanyl or whatever that they've had. But at least this will buy you some time. Sometimes it can look a little bit like someone is in a diabetic coma. Some of the same sort of, fluttering of the eyes, like you said, paleness, sweaty skin, they kind of drop where they are and sort of pass out. So if you administer Narcan and it's not an opioid or opiate overdose, it's not going to hurt them. It's not going to do anything at all. It's like taking a placebo. It's just not going to do anything at all to hurt them. And then I was just talking to the sheriff before we started, and they all carry this Narcan nasal spray. If you want to talk about that a little bit, because I carry it with me as well.
We do. So it's administered, it's furnished to every deputy, custodial and patrol deputy that we have. And essentially what it does is it's administered through the nasal cavity for both ourselves and people we may encounter that could be affected by fentanyl. It's not uncommon for deputy sheriffs or police officers to actually overdose on this inadvertently when conducting a search or when dealing with the general public, as most of us should not have any actual tolerance to fentanyl. Hopefully no law enforcement officer is using it. But the effects, of course, for us are very great. Additionally, we come across people all the time that are overdosing. One of the scariest things is that fentanyl can actually make its way into the jail. It's not uncommon for this to occur and for overdoses inside the facility to happen. So because of this, all of the custodial deputies are also issued Narcan. One of the most interesting things is that fentanyl is so powerful these days that it's taking 7 or 8 dosages of the actual nasal Narcan to bring people back inside the facility from overdoses. This is an extraordinary thing, considering that in the past, usually 1 or 2 doses would be enough to save their life. Now we're talking about quadrupling that amount in order to negate the effects of the fentanyl, which only goes to show the strength of the drug that's coming into the facility. And if it's in the facilities, it's in our county in general, right? Because in order to get into the jail, it has to exist on the outside of it first.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And I don't know anyone that carries 8 or 10 of those on them. I carry a few on me all the time, mainly because my primary assignment is to investigate this epidemic. But at the same time, that's quite a lot of nasal sprays to have on you in order to revive one individual.
Each one of these, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Each one of these has 2 sprays in it. And this vial, like I said, is only 1. But yeah, this used to be kind of a guarantee that you were going to be able to bring somebody back. And now even this isn't enough, just with the 2 sprays in it. But at least it's a chance. And hopefully you can bring somebody back long enough until, and then do CPR and things like that until medical service can arrive.
How quickly do they have to act to bring somebody out of the overdose or the poisoning? And what is the rate of survival for people who are poisoned?
So the exact rate of survival, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, so I can't quite comment on that, but it's going to be almost an immediate reaction when Narcan's administered, but you need to administer it within probably 2 minutes.
2 to 3,
2 to 3, or else you're going to have essentially somebody who's already expired, right? They've
Brain
already
death,
died.
yeah.
And you'll find this a lot too, is where they'll start breathing again, but the brain has died, right? You're essentially brain dead and they're being kept alive by compressions to the chest because the blood is still flowing up until the point where they can receive true medical treatment aside from first aid, but that may or may not be too late. Now, if you administer it fast enough, I've also seen personal cases where people just get up and walk away. Like, that's it, they're done. It's immediately negated the effect of the opioid. They're breathing again. They stand up and they're just going to go about their day because this is not the first time that they've overdosed on it. And not every overdose results in a death. A lot of people have overdosed multiple times. And I've talked to users that have overdosed several times in their life. And they're like, oh, so-and-so brings me back. And then I just go about my life. Like it's a casual, normal thing. And what's sad is that in no circumstance should that ever be a casual thing to talk about. Hey, I almost died today, but maybe tomorrow will be a better day, or maybe I'll almost die again. And when that individual's life has gotten to that point, that's a problem not only for that person, but for society in general. Right. And that's where we have something going from a personal problem to an actual epidemic in this county and this nation.
Right. It's a complete agonist. So it puts you into immediate withdrawal. And you can probably speak to this, Sheriff, that people get very angry when they come back because now they're immediately in withdrawal and they maybe remember taking the drug, maybe not, but now they're in horrific withdrawal. And withdrawal from opioids is one of the most excruciating kinds of withdrawals that you can possibly imagine. You're sweating, you're freezing, you're vomiting, your skin is crawling like it has bugs under it. You're defecating on yourself. You can barely crawl. Most people, honestly, cannot go more than a couple days into withdrawal before they just succumb. And they can't withdraw on their own safely. It's that horrific. And tragically, an awful lot of people wind up withdrawing on a jail room floor, which is absolutely unconscionable. It's really horrific when it happens that way. But if that was enough to teach people, that's what I've heard from some, well, they'll learn their lesson now. And like you said, they come back after, I almost died today. And, that's not how it works. The human psyche is not like that. We don't just learn a lesson and then we walk away. Okay, I'm done with that. For some, but for most people, it doesn't work that way.
So we're talking about fentanyl, but during the course of this conversation, a whole lot of other drugs have been named. Is this a symptom of a greater issue with addiction? Because it seems like if you're a dealer or manufacturer, killing your customer base isn't good for business, but maybe they have unlimited demand.
The drug trade is much like you said, it's a business, right? So drug dealers normally don't go out with the idea of, I want to kill as many of my users as possible, because that would like a business saying, I hope I only get one customer and they never return. Well, you'll never make money that way, right? This is essentially a business. It's just in the black market and it's illegal to do. But the thing with fentanyl is that it's so addictive. It's almost as saying that, hey, this is the cost of doing business. Some people will perish, but more people will be addicted and keep coming back. While we don't want, and I'm not saying an individual dealer thinks this way, right? This is a generalization that I'm giving, but the essential thought process is some people may perish, most will not, but most will become addicted and they'll keep buying from me. Thus, I will stay in business if I'm the dealer. Thus, I can keep making money. And the more potent my drug is, the more my prices can raise and the more profit I can make.
It's kind of like the tobacco industry, really. They know that if somebody becomes addicted, and nicotine is one of the most powerful types of addiction that you can possibly get into. But if they know they get so many customers, they'll have them for a very long time, usually. And yes, they will pass away probably from some tobacco-related illness as they get older, emphysema, cancer, and so on. But they got a whole new crop of young ones coming in. So like the sheriff said, it's unfortunate, but it's so terribly addicted and people don't know they're taking it. And they try a certain, pill or snort, white powder, whatever. And it was so unbelievably high, producing incredible feelings. Imagine having an orgasm for 20, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever. I mean, you can't. The human brain can't even fathom that kind of feeling. And so you're going to keep, it's what causes potentiation. It's just like when you're hungry, you know what foods you like, and you go back to those same foods, and you know what foods you really love. It keeps you satiated, and you keep, it's potentiation, it's survival. You keep going back. And so it's the same thing with fentanyl laced, you're going to keep going back until something intervenes in one way or another.
Which communities or demographics are at greatest risk of this epidemic?
I would say certainly, all ages, but certainly young people, because they just aren't educated enough. It's not anybody's fault. It's not a blame, but they are, it's part of the human condition as an adolescent and person in their young 20s to be curious and to want to explore the world, and they hear from friends and so on. And so, they try different things where someone who's a little older, they don't tend to just start out in their middle years of life using different substances, perhaps because of, again, life circumstances may lead them to, have horrific pain or whatever, psychologically and physically. And then I also worry about elderly people because their tolerance for any kind of medication is lowered. And so if they get medication, especially they're on food stamps, they can't afford a lot of things. They heard from, again, their best friends, neighbors, cousins, whoever, that these medicines will help with your arthritis pain. When I was an addiction counselor, I had the youngest person I ever sent to residential treatment was 10 years old, who had been given drugs all his life from infancy on. And I had people in their 80s that were addicted to different pain medications and so on that doctors gave to them. Again, I'm not slamming doctors, but gave to them thinking, well, this is helping them. They don't call me every week for something else. They're dealing with their pain. And so eventually they get into trouble with them. So
as a whole, youth take more risks, right? When I was younger, I would take more risks than I do in my mid-30s now. And I think as we spoke of the human condition, this is generalized for most people. So we think that we're invincible, right? Young people are like, hey, I can do this. I'm going to live a long life. I'm strong. I'm youthful. I'm going to survive this. One of the most interesting things that I've done in my career is I do a lot of surveillance, and in surveillance, I watch things and I watch people, usually to establish probable cause to arrest a dealer. In doing surveillance on known dealers, I've seen a complete plethora of walks of life buy from dealers. Most people think, oh, you're a fentanyl addict. You must be impoverished, smell, you're transient. You have all these problems in life. I've seen people in brand new Audis drive up lifted trucks, people wearing nurse outfits, doctor's outfits, right, that are illegally purchasing drugs as I'm watching this firsthand on surveillance, and I'm making notes of all these different kinds of people. But I speak to this not to necessarily out one group or another, but to say that fentanyl transcends, and drug use and addiction transcend any kind of demographic, age barriers, race barriers, religion barriers, right? There is nothing that will say, hey, this person over here, because they belong to this group, definitely can't be affected by fentanyl, or this person is more likely to be affected by fentanyl or an addiction. It's essentially going to affect a human being the same way, regardless of how that person was raised or their status in life at the time. And I've seen this firsthand in this county. There is nothing that's going to stop somebody who is addicted to a drug from obtaining that drug, unless, again, there's a major intervening life-changing event that causes that person to either say, hey, I'm going to stop now, whether it's rehab or a near close death experience, or until death actually stops the addiction because the person expires and they can no longer tolerate it.
drug abuse is an equal opportunity disease. And it changes the actual plasticity, how your brain functions, and even the actual movement in your brain and what it looks like. So that it's in the diagnostic statistic manual of mental health disorders, because it is a disease. And it has an etiology, it runs its course, and we know the outcome, and that's the American Medical Association very short summarized definition of a disease. But until something intervenes in that disease process, the person is going to keep using because they are so addicted, they have no other choice. Like I said, they can try, and I know many, many people that have tried and failed on their own, especially with opioids. It's extremely difficult to stop on your own.
We've talked about addicts and recreational drug users, but from what I've seen in headlines, this also affects innocent individuals as well. And a lot of the headlines I see that happen in the immediate area, you, Detective Lawson, have firsthand account knowledge of those arrests or those issues. And specifically, I want to talk about an 18-month-old in Riverbank who died and the parents were arrested. I'm sure that's just one example of that happening all around the area. Can you maybe talk about that instance and those effects of fentanyl?
I can. So back in December, and this is extremely tragic, an 18-month-old boy got into a small amount of fentanyl that was essentially left and used by his parents in the open. The parents had fallen asleep, and this was ingested by the 18-month-old. Deputies and first responders, EMS, firemen immediately got to the scene and rendered all sorts of aid to the 18-month-old, transported him to the hospital, kept working on him, but ultimately he died. It's extremely sad. This small child had no chance in life due to the mistakes of their parents, right? The parents were later arrested, and this is an ongoing investigation, so I'm not going to live too many of the details on the podcast. But essentially, in my participation in this investigation and my assistance, what you learn is that it's very difficult to talk about, right, when you're dealing with infancy. But this drug transcends, again, all sorts of barriers that would normally prevent things from going on in society, to include the killing of innocent children. There's nothing the child did wrong in this case other than exist and play in their general home that they would always grow up in and live in. this can happen anywhere, right? This even so much as in my daily activities in investigating this drug, I have to take extreme care that I don't inadvertently bring this home. It gets on my clothing, or in processing this and booking it as evidence, right? I transfer this somehow to my child at home, and then this same tragedy happens. It's so strong and potent that children, and this isn't the first time we've had a child die in this county from it, it's just the most recent time. It's lethal, right? There's nothing that is worse than losing a truly innocent life. And in this case, there's nothing more that can be done other than saying that this drug is so potent, it should be avoided at all costs, regardless of whether you're a recreational user or a complete addict. I don't think anyone wants to see a child die in this world. I think vast majority of people are good, right? We don't want anything bad to happen to our youth and our children, especially our infants. But ultimately, our mistakes and our addictions can affect other people that they don't intend to affect. And that's what you're seeing in a case like this.
It absolutely affects the family and anybody else, that's associated with that person when they become involved in either casual use or they become addicted. It's really very rare to see someone as a casual opioid user. They tend to become addicted very quickly, especially a vast majority have underlying co-occurring disorders like depression, anxiety, and so on. And so, they're not the most careful, as the detective was saying, and, they can leave things in their medicine cabinet or next to their bedstand or whatever. And innocent people, anybody, in the family can use it, or even friends, whatever. So the important thing is when the person gets treatment, that the entire family does as well, because it has been devastating for families, no matter what.
Are there any myths or misconceptions regarding the drug? I've heard conflicting information. Some have said you have to ingest the drug to potentially be poisoned. Others have said that even just getting it on your skin could be lethal.
I remember the initial myth of saying if fentanyl powder gets on your skin, you're going to immediately perish, right? That was actually one of the biggest scares when this first hit our county. A powder, like anything else, normally is not going to be absorbed through the pores of your skin, right? And I teach this when I teach my fentanyl safety classes. That's not to say that you should grab some powder, throw it on your skin and say, hey, I'm safe. But liquid fentanyl, like the kind that's transdermal, right, that's administered in hospitals, that's meant to go through your skin, right? But that's actually normally lawfully given to cancer patients, people with major pain issues that need this prescribed to them and safely absorbed in small amounts. Mm-hmm. Illicit fentanyl, the stuff that we find on the streets, the M30 pills, the fake Xanaxes, the Percocets, right, the Hulks, the green pills, these generally need to be either ingested by swallowed or they're smoked. And that's the primary way, including the powder, which is usually smoked, is a primary way of ingesting it. But it's very possible that you can put powder in your mouth, and I believe in the case of the infant, somehow this baby was able to ingest it, right? The baby definitely did not smoke the powder, but it got into their system, right? And so any way of getting this into your body can have that negative effect. The biggest myth is essentially that, if you touch it, you'll die. That's not true. But if it gets into your system, so whether it's through the eyes, the nose, the mouth, in some way into the bloodstream, that can kill you. And then again, you don't know what the potency of the drug that you're taking is. Exactly.
And if your skin really is a big sponge. That's why you put lotion on your hands and a few seconds later, a minute, it's gone and it's absorbed. So you'd have to get at least some amount on your skin. But if you have an open cut or something, or an open sore, and you happen to get some in there, whether it's powder or the pill, it was crushed a little bit. I mean, looking at it, no, you're not going to overdose, and possibly touching it, you won't know. But there are so many other ways for it to get into the bloodstream. It's not something to mess around with, for sure.
If it does get on your skin, and what I tell people is this, right? Dry brush it off first. Use cold water, something that would constrict the skin. Don't use hot water that would open up your pores. Don't use like an alcohol-based sanitizer that would do the same. Although that's very common, especially in the post-pandemic era, right? We have Purell everywhere. That's actually the last thing you want to use. So cold soap, cold water, and a dry brush first is usually going to be okay if you don't know what got on you. And if you do experience symptoms, right? You're drowsy, your eyes are fluttering, right? Have someone call 911. Again, we talked about Narcan can be administered even if you're not in an opioid overdose, you're not going to have harm from it, right? It's essentially a placebo. If there is an opioid in your system, it'll negate the effects. If there's not, it's okay to administer it, but still seek medical attention if you have those symptoms going on. And especially if a powder, you may have inhaled it, things can get airborne. You may have taken something and you believed it was one thing. I think the biggest stigma I want people to overcome is don't be embarrassed to go get the help. Save your own life if that's what it takes, right? Because it's much better to tell that story than to have no story to tell because you didn't seek help and you overdosed and perished.
And as we've been saying, you may experience some effects because it got into your body somehow. And then thankfully somebody just happens to have nasal spray and they use it on you and then you seem okay. But depending on the dose, your tolerance, all those things, a few minutes later, you actually could start to experience trouble again because the Narcan wasn't enough and it wears off. So you always seek medical help.
And as we near the end of the podcast, this might be an impossible question, but what is the solution? Is there a solution?
Boy, if we all had the answer to that one. But I think a lot has to do with education. And I think, again, it's a huge mindset to think about harm reduction. But knowing the human condition and that we all self-medicate for various reasons. Everybody's experienced trauma in life, some certainly a whole lot more than others, and how we deal with that and so on, our coping mechanisms. But people are still going to use medications and drugs. So just getting that information out there. And I would love to see nasal sprays in every single household, every single person have them. I'm not promoting the use at all of fentanyl or any other kinds of opioids, but the fact that they're happening out there, if we have some way to at least bring people back and then get more medical help and hopefully maybe praying that person then with support will get into some sort of treatment.
No, I completely agree. There's ultimately no true solution to drug addiction and drug overdose, right? We know from studies for 30, 50 years, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. Yeah. We can slow down the influx with major dealers into this area, but there's no way of stopping every single gram of powder or gram of illegal drugs from coming into this area, nor is there a way of stopping every individual user from using. But much like when you want to change the mindset, you have to change a generation, right? You have to educate people from a very young age to the dangers, the major dangers of this, right? We're not in the era of, we smoked a little bit of weed growing up. Things are okay. I've dabbled in X, Y, and Z, but then I grew out of this because back in those days, things were not laced to the point of massive addiction or death. Right. And I think, again, education is probably the number one way of preventing and stymieing the fentanyl epidemic. Although ultimately it will probably still occur because people have the right to make their own choices and they're going to do so. I just hope that with education, people will make smarter choices. And even if they are addicted, the smartest choice they can make, and going back to the 18-month-old that died, is keeping this as far away from their children and in a contained environment where their kids cannot access as possible. That way, at least the innocent can remain innocent. And if you choose to make your own decisions in life, those decisions do not affect those that have no control of it.
Well, thank you, too, for coming on the podcast. This is a university which is mostly comprised of young adults who are here to learn and also gain new experiences. And a lot of that involves experimentation and curiosity, and that can lend itself to recreational drug use. So with that in mind, what's your message for these young folks?
Tons of resources on the internet and so on, but you have to make sure that you look for like the American Medical Association, the CDC, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Association, and places like that. But locally, as I said, in our area, one of the best places to gain information, and there's a drop-in center. Anybody can just go there and ask for information. They're open Monday through Friday, the normal 9 to 5 hours, but Stanislaus Recovery Center. And I really encourage people to check out Open, Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous meetings. They're listed on the internet. They're listed in the paper. Anybody can go and you'll get a lot of information there just from attending. If you go to an open meeting, anybody can go. And it's just like you're there to get information. In my class, I have required that students go to 2 open meetings just to listen and gain from people who've been there. and they'll learn life lessons, believe me, just to listen. You don't have to say anything, just absorb it all. And then closed meetings are for people who actually want to do something about either their substance abuse or their addiction. And they will get a lot more resources there as well.
And my final thoughts are this, especially to the students at the CSU, where, I graduated from here. I'm a proud graduate of Stanislaus State. I would implore you, please do not take something that you don't know its origins of, right? If you're going to take pills and they're prescribed by a doctor, perfectly fine, no problem at all. But anything other than that, even if it's given to you by a friend, a close relative, somebody that says, hey, I've tried something like this, it's good to go, they don't know. And the biggest problem is this: you can get a batch of 10 pills and 9 of them are going to have no effect on the person using them, but 1 of them will kill you. And there's no way to tell which one of the 10 is the one with the lethal dose. So please, please, please do not take something that you don't know the origins of. Get something prescribed by a doctor. That's fine. Those are medical professionals that know what they're giving you. Don't take something that is given to you by a friend because maybe it was safe for another time they used it.
Thank you for listening to the Stan State EduCast. We hope this conversation was both engaging and educational for everyone listening. You can find the Stan State EduCast online at www.csustan.edu/podcast. And you can also listen to episodes on your podcasting platform of choice. So until our next discussion, stay safe and stay warrior strong.